Welcome back to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast, where we will explore the local arts, culture, and community in the Lehigh Valley. We'll be doing this through conversations with individual artists, administrators, and organizations. We'll discuss all types of mediums with the goal of enriching local arts culture.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast. I'm Ben, and this week we will have an episode featuring a conversation with Eliana Vélez and Elise Schaefer. Born and raised in rural eastern Pennsylvania with a Jewish mother and Puerto Rican father, Eliana Vélez was inspired to create art that could encapsulate her specific experiences with adversity and trauma throughout her life. As a survivor of sexual abuse and a person with a learning disability, she tries to create self-portraits that can allow people to understand her perspective whilst also working through her traumas emotionally. Her work is both a representational self-portrait of her face, but also an emotional self-portrait created by the vintage collage materials and found objects from her own life. These paintings are almost like diary entries and scrapbook pages, making comments about capitalism and institutionalized prejudice in the United States. In her experience, when you are a minority, every facet of your life is inherently political, and she works to convey this message within her work.
Eliana, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me in our pre-recording mindfulness technique that both of us started hyperventilating a little bit during.
Yes.
But I'm so glad that you're here. And
Thanks.
I'm glad that we have
so glad to be here.
time to talk about your artwork and that you brought your artwork here with you today.
Yes.
Which is very exciting.
My brother's Subaru Outback.
Oh.
I shoved it in there.
Wonderful. Love.
With all my Wawa garbage.
Nice. Love it. Love it. I like that you're really painting a full picture of like the studio to
absolutely
studio to gallery kind of
1-bedroom apartment to here.
Amazing. Wonderful. Well, I'm so glad you made it over here this morning. We're here to talk about you and your artwork and your amazing portraiture work.
Oh,
which,
thank you.
We're so lucky to have sitting right in front of us here today. But I thought we'd start with just a little bit about you and how you got started making art.
So I started making art, I guess technically not like actual fine art, but I just always was drawing as a kid. Like my parents used to joke that like I made so many drawings I would give them, they like would have to throw them away because like they just like didn't have room. Like they didn't have the wall space for all the drawings I would just like pump out all the time. And I think my parents still too, they have like a little like some painting we did in class from like kindergarten, like hanging up in the house because they thought it was like so impressive for like a kindergartner or whatever. Because it like, I don't know, it just, they said like it didn't look like everybody else's. I don't really see it. It's like just like some flowers we do with sponges, but they find it to be really special. And then by the time I reached middle school, I went to the Arts Academy, practiced visual art there. I had pretty cool teachers though. They taught us about Dadaism and things even like in middle school. So
Awesome.
Started out with a pretty good like at least art history foundation. And then I went to charter arts in high school and definitely studied art there for 4 years. So yeah.
Amazing. How was your experience with that? Did you like having like an art focused in your young education?
I can't say I disliked it because I don't know what it would have been like otherwise. Mm-hmm. Like just in general with having art 3 hours a day, I think is like a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. I'm definitely grateful for the education I got that helped me, practice, like learn a craft essentially. But I do think the intensity of that school and my education was actually pretty detrimental on like my creative process.
Interesting.
And was hard. But in general too, even if I hadn't gone there, I have a very artistic family, like I grew up going to my parents taking us on outings to like art museums and they're both like history nerds. My mom's a writer. My dad went to school for music education. So, definitely we were always like, I just live in a very creative household. So I think it would have been a part of my life no matter what. Even if I went to public school, I probably also like still would have like taken art classes or hung out with the art teacher after school or something. I don't know.
Totally.
With like weird kids, probably. I would have ended up with the weird kids no matter what. But yeah.
Awesome. I'm personally very invested in this idea of like alternate timelines and how every decision you make is very, I believe you're fated for something like whatever comes to you finds you the when and where it's supposed to. But this alternate timeline thing where we still have some sort of choice and how you get there is a little bit different. So like the choice that you make to go to an arts academy versus like a public high school, what effect that had on your art making process or your creative process or the eventuality of the art that you make now,
Definitely.
I think is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, academically speaking, and I mean like in terms of like art, academically speaking, visual art. It was an incredible education. I mean, the thing too, like it was basically like getting a bachelor's, you know what I mean? But like from like 14 to 18.
Yeah.
And like, unlike even college students who go to school for art, I mean, we learned art history every other day for like 4 years, you know what I mean? And we went to school 180 days a year and we had like art every day for 3 hours. So, you know, I mean, it was like academically, it was an incredible education and I had great teachers in that kind of sense. I do think just in general, and I think a lot of kids that go to that school talk about this a lot, or at least a lot of the kids I know, just like the intensity though of like doing critiques at like 14 and, you know, like, I mean, kids would make fun of each other if their art was bad. You know what I mean? Like that is like, that's crazy for like teenagers.
Yeah.
And like, I didn't fully recognize the kind of toll that took until I was a lot older. I really didn't start even making art until like fine art until this year. Everything I did was kind of just like academic, but also I was very like scared to do it. My teachers were very, very classical. So like, or classically inclined, I should say. So like they didn't believe Dadaism was a real movement. They really didn't, they liked abstract art, but like they were very much so micromanagers. And to some extent, you know, I understand that for like teenagers. But then it also like begs the question, should teenagers be in a situation where they're like being rigorously trained, you know what I mean, to be artists? Or should this, you know, should it be more creative focused and more for kids if you're a kid, you know? So I definitely think, you know, it was an incredible school, but I do think it has a bit of like breeding you for like some fantastic college, you know, kind of slant to it, which unfortunately a lot of like public charter schools have.
Well, it sounds like really competitive too, which
very much so. And it's like, it's weird because people don't really talk about how competitive it is. Like everybody kind of just acts like it's like fun and free and everybody's weird. And, you know, we all choose to go here because we would have been like bullied in, you know, public school or whatever, or we're the weirdos. And so like everybody kind of acts like it's fun and free, but truthfully, like, you know, I mean, I can't tell you how many times kids ran out of critiques crying and like hid in the bathrooms. Like that happened multiple times. Kids flipped desks during critiques. Like things were nuts. Like people were, I mean, I remember there was this one girl that would like, she had like made music videos and stuff and things and put them out and like kids used to play it and like make fun of it and stuff like all over the school. Like they definitely, your art was like very much so judged. And even if you were like not so cool, but you were very talented, people liked you more. You know what I mean? Like your popularity definitely weighed on whether or not you were good at what you were doing.
That's a really complicated overlap because you're in high school anyways, so
yeah,
it's difficult because
so it's like not just about like what you wear and like well, that's the thing too is like going to a school like that where like the like musical theater nerds are like the popular kids and like there's no jocks or anything, you know what I mean? Like nobody can be put in their place. So your goal, like instead of just like I don't know, dressing trendy, you have to look like you're like a Pinterest or like Instagram model. Like you have to look like you're like on the cover of Vogue when you're just like going to class. Like seriously, like kids would wear like full like I don't even know, like $300 like suit pieces. I felt like I don't know, like kids would wear I don't even know how to describe that. Like they just would wear like expensive vintage clothes and like things you shouldn't be wearing to school. I don't know. Like I mean, kids would show up in like sweatpants and stuff too, like any other school, but kids would come in and wear giant heels all day, like knee-high like boots and like crazy stuff. And like some of it was like fun and artistic, but some of it like created this really weird pressure. Like I never felt comfortable in school showing up in sweatpants in high school. And now as an adult, I look back and I wish I felt more cool dressing as like a kid, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or just like chilling at school. But there was so much pressure to be like cool and artistic at the same time and like have a good fashion sense.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, because where in that line do you develop like a personal sense of style or the ability to like feel comfortable in what you're wearing if you're wearing things? And I think that's true of any high school, but it sounds like absolutely amplified here in this situation where how do you find what you're comfortable? Like I just turned 25 and like I'm still working on that.
Me too. But it took me like a long time to really figure out my sense of personal style, especially too, like being an artist and being a very messy artist. I've ruined my clothes all the time. Like I paint on like everything. And I shop at mostly like thrift stores and stuff. So a lot of my clothes are vintage, and I have some really beautiful vintage pieces that like I've gotten paint on and I've been like, holy crap. Like just recently I was like, I need to go to Old Navy and just like buy some sweatpants. Like I don't own just like basic normal clothes that I can just like trash. Like I don't own things like that. Even the t-shirts I own are like cool vintage tees. And I was like, okay, I need to like get some stuff. But like I still felt this weird thing. Like people are like, I don't know. Like I feel a pressure to be always new and different and artistic and original. And a lot of that does come from the pressures of high school and the particular kind of high school I went to, where you had to also be like, people didn't like you even if you dressed like everybody else. Like you also you were supposed to be cool, but also completely original. Yeah. And that was like, I don't know, very, very strange. It's only like kids who went there really understand, but I know, like, you know, if kids who went there are listening to this, they're like, yeah, definitely. And everyone you talk to goes to that school. Like, if you say that stuff, they're like, yeah. Every now and then you meet a kid who went there who's just like, yeah, I loved it. It was just fun. And like, it was just cool. Yeah, we just learned art. But then all the other kids are like, okay, yeah, all right. Well, it made me insane, but all right.
So in keeping with this theme of your school experience as it relates to your art, I wanted to circle back to kind of talking about creative process and maybe what that looked like for you then and what that looks like for you now.
So when I started making art for, like, in a sense that I wanted to be an artist, and I thought, this is my craft. I'm working towards something. You know, I'm working towards being an artist later in life. I never really thought I was going to be a fine artist. I just kind of didn't, because I never found joy out of just like making art. Like there always was like an academic purpose behind it. And truthfully, because of how rigorous my school was, like the actual workload, there wasn't really time to just do things on your own that weren't curated by somebody. And for the most part, everything we did had some sort of like theme with it, which makes sense, like, you know, in terms of the learning process, especially for teenagers. You know, like if we did, we would have personal projects that were different from our like academic projects, but we would still have to like do them in pastel. They would have to be a portrait. They would have to be, you know, a landscape or, you know, something like that. So I really had no understanding of what my own personal process was, especially because they kind of outlined even how our sketchbook was supposed to look, how we were supposed to work through ideas. Like they created this idea like, you know, every time we use a new material or like a new medium, we had to practice with it and document those practices in our sketchbook. But for me too, like I'm an experimental artist. Like it's almost more important for me to mess it up and to waste materials than it is for me to like practice somewhere else. Like that's how I find joy out of making art, is also through being experimental. And that's the thing too with like, learning in that traditional kind of way or whatever, that like, you know, it was kind of like art isn't about like necessarily finding joy in it or just like being creative. Like that's a hobby. That's not a craft, which I do think to some extent is true. But also like, how are you going to like, how would you be a fine artist and love what you do if you're not loving your process?
Right.
Those are different things. And so it took a really, really long time for me to kind of unlearn that way of thinking, because every time I would go to make a piece of art, I would pull out my sketchbook and be like, all right, let me write down the dimensions of it. Let me, write down all the materials I think I'm going to use. Let me put down exactly what I think. Let me make all my different thumbnails. Let me try different techniques. It's like completely different from the process I do now. And my professor, Jeremy Sight at LTRIC, Lehigh Carbon Community College, is kind of like helped me unlearn all of this stuff and helped me just like create, which was very, very hard for me to do. I couldn't just like experiment. And ultimately, I found that's what I love. I think that's how I fell in love with collage, actually, because I kind of always felt like collage was, which I don't think this is necessarily true now, but it definitely has like a kitschy kind of element to it, or like a crafty kind of element. And I mean, people make vision boards, you don't have to necessarily be like extremely talented or even know how to paint to like collage necessarily. So I started making collages just in like a therapeutic way. Like, I just started just like taking clippings out, and I even like collaged on my wall in my bedroom at my parents' house. And it was cool because you didn't have to think about it. Like it was just fast imagery. And I didn't like, I could say like, this isn't really my art. Like I'm just like doing whatever for fun. Like I'm just collaging. And that kind of helped open up that like doorway for me to figure out how I wanted my process to actually be. Where now like, I gather pieces of wood from the side of the road. I steal them from my parents' garage. I like take shelves apart. Like, I don't care what the actual dimensions are. You know what I mean? And like, I honestly don't even know until I have to like put them on something or whatever, or like even like, and even then like I'm coming up with like an approximation.
Right.
I don't even measure them. I like can't be bothered. But like, I don't know like the exact dimensions of it. I gesso the surface. I don't like worry about it too much though. I just do like a couple coats of gesso, especially because gessoing in my 1-bedroom apartment is like really hard because like you can't get gesso out of anything, and like my carpets are destroyed. Especially because collage is so dependent on the materials you have at a given moment, and it can always be different, and doing it is like one of a kind. There isn't really a way you can plan it out. Like there isn't really a way for me to plan out like this is the collage imagery I'm going to put in here, because it's all totally different. You know what I mean? And once I use something, that's it. That's the only kind of that magazine I had, the only print of that ad that I have, you know what I mean? Or the only photo shoot that I have in that magazine or whatever. So it also created this thing for me where I was able to not think so hard about practicing or perfecting my process before I did it, And the first piece I did this year, which was my first professional piece ever. Everything else I had ever done, I never did it on nice materials. I just felt like I wasn't good enough. I really didn't think I was like good at art. Like even sitting here still, I'm still like, dude, I have no reason to have anyone ask me about my art. Like this is not professional. Like this does not look good. Like I need to practice more. I need to draw more. Like, my academic self is like, dude, like that is not, proportions aren't perfect on that. Like that is not like, I still have this really negative thought process, I guess, or negative self that tells me that I still need to like hone my craft more before I could show it to anyone or give it any worth.
I think it's difficult, right? To have this trained understanding of, and I'll use air quotes, fine art.
Yeah.
And then kind of reaching this comfortability with a medium that has a history of craft, quote, quote. And I'm curious if you feel like you talked a little bit about how you're working to overcome this and it's ongoing, but how do you, in your mind, define fine art?
Fine art, I feel like it's art that is purely meant to be creative or thought-provoking. It's meant to not necessarily be seen in like a gallery, like a brick and mortar gallery, but I just mean like it's meant to be viewed by people and not necessarily serve a purpose of like something that you can use in your life. You know what I mean? Because obviously artists create spoons, artists create pots, you know what I mean? They design these things. And that is art, you know what I mean? But it's not the same thing as like, you know, creating an installation piece that's literally just for the purpose of people to view for its beauty, lack thereof, for its purpose, and just like, I guess, like just pure design. I think it's like, because I really do think all fine art is pure abstraction to some extent. You know what I mean? Like I don't really, like I hate when people say art looks realistic, because the only kind of realistic art is photorealist art. You know what I mean? And even then, like, it's still, in a way, an abstraction of reality. I mean, the whole point of art, fine art, is to abstract reality so that it's uglier than it was in person, prettier than it was in person, and to kind of, like, move through a person to another to show them what they saw in their own head. So I kind of think all art is, like, abstract.
I like that. I struggle constantly with this term fine art, and I'll challenge you just for the sake of conversation.
Do it.
Where
I love it.
This idea of like art designed for people to see. In my head, I'm thinking like there is a lot of art that ends up in a museum or in a gallery or wherever that was never intended to see by the artist, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that you're saying that changes like the validity of it, but do you think that changes like how a person views that piece of artwork? Like, do you think that's something that's telling or something that is more like privatized in the viewer's eyes?
Like, I really believe in people freeing themselves from any kind of social norm or any kind of thing society built up or whatever. So I kind of feel like, too, like there's a weird pressure from the world that if you're talented at something, you should be showing it. But I also feel like that's just internalized capitalism telling us that we always need to be competing. We always need to be making money. If we don't have money and we don't have success and notoriety, we're literally a worthless person. So I guess like fine art specifically, like, yeah, I would say fine art is a profession and a craft, and that, you know, if you're a fine artist, then you are making work to be seen. But I don't think all artists want to make work to be seen. Right. And that doesn't mean it's not beautiful and incredible, and that it's not like valid. You know what I mean? Yeah, definitely like I mean, there are people all over the world making art that, you know, is never really going to be seen maybe by anyone, but is even more incredible than what we have in museums. So I don't know if that's like a direct answer to the question.
It doesn't have to be.
But I guess that's true that like, I mean, I guess I think too, like talking about professions and fine art, a lot of it is influenced by the way capitalism teaches us about how to make money. Right. And basically like that, you know, I mean, fine art that's meant to be seen is then meant to be bought, you know, by somebody, and you're meant to make money off of it. And you're not really a professional artist if you're not making money off your art.
Right. And I think in a lot of cases, things end up in museums or galleries because someone thinks you're supposed to like them. Like it's not
absolutely
not for the necessity of like representing everyone equally, but for the necessity of like, this is the one, this is the fine art. Like, yeah, like it or don't, but this is it. It's
and the
here.
Standard of what it is. And the people at the top really just like, artists are usually not the ones deciding what is worthy of being seen. It's usually just rich people, to be honest, just to put it plainly.
Absolutely. It's exciting because one of the other reasons that you're here today and we carved out some time is because you're going to be showing your work here in the gallery space at Steel Pixel.
I'm very excited.
I'm very excited too. And I didn't know when we were walking over to get coffee this morning that this is your first gallery show? Like
this
official?
Is my first anything besides stuff that was either at my high school or my college.
That's very exciting.
It's really exciting.
We're very excited.
It makes me feel like a real artist. I'm a real artist, you guys.
Well, I hope that people listening, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end, but there will be an opening reception for Eliana's artwork. So I'm hoping that we'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit about it, give people a preview, and that you'll come see it in person. But let's talk a little bit about this piece that we have in front of us here in the studio today.
Cool. That's my favorite one.
Your favorite one. Yeah. Mine too.
Thank you.
But yeah, give us just like the title and a little blurb about it.
So this is called See You Knew to Come Back, in quotes, which all the titles of my pieces are kind of related specifically to hospital stays.
Okay.
Because of just my life in the past few years. And to be honest with you, in all my work, there's kind of usually, maybe not so much in this one, but there's usually some kind of like, there might be pill bottles or cutouts from like anatomy books and things that relate back to hospital stuff. Because when I was 19, I had complications with a gallbladder surgery and I was in the hospital for like 2 weeks. And I had a very back and forth going in and out of the ER, and just in my life too, I've had a lot of moments where, you know, maybe difficulties I've had are minimized, or, you know, in general, like, you know, I dealt like with gallbladder pain and issues with my gallbladder for many years, and doctors kind of just like told me it was anxiety or like in my head, or like never looked in the right places. Probably largely too because, I mean, I'm a girl, I'm a person of color. And so after, when I was having this horrible pain, because basically what happened was when you get gallbladder surgery, you get your gallbladder taken out, there is a bile duct that connects to your small intestine that's supposed to get like clipped off. Well, to less than 1% of people who get that routine surgery, it just doesn't get clipped off properly, and it's not necessarily a fault of the surgeon, really. It's just kind of something that happens, anatomically speaking, and the bile leaks into your body. So it's basically stomach bile just leaking into your body, as in like just creating infection and abscess. You know, if you don't get it fixed, you would die.
Right.
It's very, very painful. Kind of felt like my stomach was like a black hole, or like someone put a torch in my abdomen. And I remembered I went to the ER, they gave me morphine, and they gave me, like, they were like, oh, eat a cracker. Oh, you feel fine? And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I feel better now. I'm on morphine. And then they're like, okay, well, you know what? We think it was just post-op pain. Go home. You know what I mean? And I was like writhing in pain. You know what I mean? And as soon as the morphine wore off, worse than it was before. And I went right back. And after the whole ordeal was over 2 weeks later, when I was getting discharged from the hospital, one of the surgeons that had seen me when I had come into the ER originally was like, see, you knew to come back. You knew something was wrong. And I was like, knew to come back? What do you mean? Like, I was like writhing in pain. I didn't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm 19. I didn't know to come back. I just had to. Like, what? So that's kind of where the name comes from. But yeah, so this piece is, I never really have a plan other than to collage and then paint myself into my pieces. Sometimes, see, I've done my pieces differently each time, kind of. Sometimes I collage and then I do the portrait. Sometimes I do the portrait and I collage around it. I think this one was kind of a mixture of the two, but I mean, the collage imagery, it's always somewhat planned in that I collage with certain materials for certain reasons. So I am kind of a hoarder, and I just keep receipts and like snatch weird things. Like, you know, if I go to a grocery store and I find like somebody's, I don't know, grocery list or whatever, I take it. I don't know, find a report card from when I was a kid, or, you know, maybe like a library book I accidentally stole when I was a kid. I'll like rip out the library thing and I'll put that in. So I try to always include things from my own personal life in them. But also, I mean, I collage with vintage Playboys because a lot of my work discusses the exploitation of women, even like, you know, in terms of, you know, talking about specifically pornography and stuff like that, and the sexual exploitation of women. So, I mean, all of it kind of centers around these themes. I mean, a lot of it also has to do with capitalism. I collage with like a lot of magazines and stuff. So, you know, advertisements and stuff. And just like, I'm like I mean, I don't really identify as any sort of label politically because you can kind of find anything wrong with like any kind of political party. Everyone should be working towards just working together, I guess, and like to put it in the most basic terms. And, I believe in socialized healthcare and things like that. So my work is like the collage largely centers around advertisements, pornography, exploitation of women, racism, all that kind of stuff. And also kind of humor. I love comedy and stuff. So I just put in like weird things. Like there's I have a cutout from like an airplane book that says "in the cockpit," which I find funny. And then I covered up like the C and cock. So it's like, it's just funny. It's like a censorship. And then
my favorite clipping is this like how to talk to women part that's kind of on the left.
And that's from a vintage Playboy. And so it has like a serious purpose, but also it's really funny. It's like, why is there an article about how to talk to women? And it's also like, it feels like this really crazy, I don't know, very serious kind of piece. And then it just says how to talk to women, which people point at and laugh at sometimes, I've seen. And then like, there's like clipping that just says Cabbage Patch on it. I don't know even where I got that from, but I just like thought it'd be really funny to just like put the word cabbage on there. So like there's definitely some humor. I mean, the collage also is just like supposed to also describe me and just like my own inner thoughts, because that's kind of what it is. I mean, when I personally am looking through a magazine that especially is vintage, like isn't in print anymore, we don't know how many of them even exist, and I'm flipping through and I find something that I personally enjoy, and then I put two images together and create a one-of-a-kind image with these things that existed. Like, that's kind of, I don't know, just kind of the inner workings of my own mind, something that's different than I feel like the painting process. In terms of, like, technical stuff, when I pick out the self-portraits, I, for some reason, like, I just can't paint without, like, seeing like blocks of color. Like it's very hard for me to paint just like a neutral or like well-lit photo. So I need to I turn the saturation all the way up because I really just like intense, like just color blocking sort of. And I honestly think probably as I go on with paintings, I see them, the portraiture becoming more and more abstract, or probably more and more like Egon Schiele and like very mangled and not really anatomically correct. But I'm still in like an anatomically correct zone, probably related to like my academic past and everything.
Yeah.
I paint with my fingers a lot. For me, just probably having ADHD as well. And like I find painting to be, because I have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I find like painting to be the most like grounding thing to me. That just like really keeps me in the moment. So like using my hands and like surface is like very important to me. Like oftentimes with my paintings, I'll just take my hand and just like move the paint around. Like not necessarily for even just like muddy it, not really even for a purpose, but just like to feel it kind of. And like, so so it's kind of almost like a sculpture in that kind of way.
It's very textured. It has a lot of texture.
I love texture a lot. And probably even as I keep going, it'll just get crazier and crazier. And like, as I keep making art, it'll like, I just recently bought modeling clay so I can start like sculpting on top of them and stuff. But yeah. But like the halo around my head, that wasn't planned. And that was more, it wasn't necessarily like it wasn't like a subject choice. It was more so, or like an emotional choice. It was more so like, I think I actually did paint the portrait first, and then I collaged around it. And then I had like just this empty section around the head and was like, what can I do? And then the halo, I kind of just like messed around and like was like, oh, that looks pretty good.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I wanted to, maybe we can sit and just like describe a little bit for our listeners what this looks like, just for like some contextual information, because it's complex and it's beautiful. And
thank you.
The portrait is so striking. So the piece that we're looking at that Eliana is talking about, it's about 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet, and it's on wood panel, like a very thin wood panel. There's a central portrait in the middle of the piece of a young woman resembling Eliana with really dark, like high volume hair and like a dark tan skin tone, red lips, and kind of has her face turned up a little bit and looking off to the left of the painting. And then surrounding the central portrait, which is just kind of from the neck up, is collage, kind of intermixed with a lot of very brushy texture, some red paint towards the top right of the painting, and then kind of darker paint and colors along the left that cascades into like a blue and a darkness along the bottom. But there's, as she mentioned before, a lot of advertisements and collage imagery interworked into the texture around the painting. And then, as she mentioned, that kind of like nimbus halo that centers around the top of her head. But it's really, like, really striking.
Thank you.
Beautiful. I'm very intrigued. And I know you mentioned like there wasn't any specific like subject interests in that, but like this like nimbus halo around your head, people associate that with like being gold, as a, like religious icon imagery.
Right.
This is not gold. It's like red and black and dark, and there's like a little kind of like gold yellow interworked into there. But what was the choice behind that, or the decision behind that? Or was there?
I never like anything to be, how can I say, it's going to sound really vague, but like plainly understood. Like I don't really like anything to be, I don't even know how to describe what I'm saying, but like an homage to anything.
Sure.
Like I like it to be, but I also, like, I want it to look dirty. Like, I don't think it should look pretty. Like, I want it to look, which I guess is, like, part of maybe working through my own feelings about myself, but also just, like, it's like, I don't know. Like, it's just muddy and complicated. And I guess maybe, too, like, I want it to be more powerful than I want it to be, like, ephemeral or, like, pretty. And too, like, I mean, those lines I made with, like, my fingers. So, like, you know, along the way, like, while I'm painting and, like, part of that process, like, my hands are covered in, like, random stuff. And, like, some of the choices on here, you know what I mean? Especially with, like, the abstraction of the paint and stuff, like, is not even fully my choice. Like, it just, like, it's just stuff that ended up there. Like, maybe I stepped on a paint bottle and, like, it squirted somewhere or something. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess it's a good point I didn't necessarily think about too. But I remembered, like, I painted on the metallic and just didn't feel like it was, like, I just felt like it needed to be dirtier, I think. Because I didn't want to necessarily make it look religious or, like, so purposeful. Like, oh, like, obviously this is, like, a halo. Like, it's obviously, like, a Madonna maybe type of thing. I wanted it to be more like, you're kind of quite, like, I guess that looks like a halo, but, like, what is it really about?
It looks like thorns almost, like it's very, which I'm not trying to connect to, like, religious iconography, but.
Well, it's hard not to with a halo.
It's hard, yeah. I think the bigger point of it is that it creates emphasis, which is the idea with a lot of that, like, imagery, is that it creates emphasis around something. And although it wasn't your intention to connect it to that, like, that's the point of it, is like, it's all directionally focused into your, like, this piece definitely has, like, that classic art history triangle thing going on. And like, I think that the halo piece, like, plays into that a lot. So,
well, definitely too. I mean, like, even though I talk about removing myself from academia and everything, like, I still, like, am very much so, like, I love looking at geometry of art. Like, I love looking at the golden section and coincidences and, like, drawing lines between things. And, like, I love measuring, you know what I mean? Like my portraits before I paint them. Like I really do love that some things about the technical process for sure. And like composition. I mean, obviously composition is like a big part of every artist thing, but like definitely like when I'm painting, like, you know, even though it's like emotional and everything too, there is just as much thought as like about the composition and about the technical side of it as there is kind of the emotional side of it as well.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, and I don't want to minimize your comment about like not creating homage to anything, but obviously artists draw inspiration.
Of course.
I had actually an artist that I thought of the second I saw the photos that Ben said of your paintings, but I'm curious if there are artists that you really feel like your work is inspired by, or artists, it doesn't even have to be your work, but artists that you enjoy or feel that their work is very meaningful.
Definitely. Sometimes when people ask me about like my favorite artist, I go blank. Let me just like
You're good.
process. All right. So one artist that I used to say was my favorite artist, which I kind of found him not really out of my own volition. And I'm not really a fan of the thing is too, and I feel like a lot of artists are this way, where they like certain artists, but not for what they're known for. So I used to say my favorite one was Alberto Giacometti. I'm not a huge fan of his sculptures. I love his paintings and his sculptures. He was like a perfectionist and like kind of not fully there, like nuts and like dirty and weird, and like his like portraits and stuff. And even like it's just like it's very gestural. And two, like when I draw, especially, like I always had this when I was like, all my art teachers were always trying to teach this out of me because when I would draw, like I couldn't just draw a line. Like I drew like 25 lines. Like everything I would draw would be gestural and like dirty and messy. And they were always being like, oh my God, like no, like draw one line, like just make it clean, like make it nice. And like I couldn't. Like they were always teaching it out of me, and it'd always be like, this is my style. And they'd always be like, you're a teenager, you don't know your style. But truthfully, it never changed about me. And I don't know if it's just like the way my hands work. Like it just is the way I write, the way I draw. So I found Giacometti because my art teacher, I think my junior year, saw still life I was doing and was like, you know, your work kind of looks like Giacometti's work. You know what I mean? Or, you know, it was making me think of that. And I was like, who? And then I looked at it and was like, oh, because that was like probably the first moment I saw an artist doing something that I was told was incorrect. And like he was a professional artist. You know what I mean?
He was
in
known
museums
enough.
and like helped start the modernist movement. And I was like, oh crap. Like, then I can make art like him, like whatever. You know what I mean? Like what I'm doing is right then. You know what I mean? So that was a big one. Duchamp is huge for me. I mean, I definitely like his abstract and like cubist works, and even some of his more like figurative works when he was younger. But of course, too, like, not that I have a particular ready-made I'm, like, a fan of, but just, like, his tongue-in-cheek and just sarcastic way of just, like, I mean, and honestly, like, he was, like, a pretentious, like, white French man, and, like, I don't know how political or anti-capitalist his work necessarily was, but for me, that's what I get out of it. Like, just placing a urinal, like in a beautiful gallery of rich people, to me is just, like, the most badass thing in the world, and I just love it, and, like, I just love, like, he just, like, didn't care about anything, and, like, I just think that I, like, definitely fell in love with him when I was younger. Lee Krasner, I love. I definitely just, I have a lot of pure abstract artists I just like in general. But I also really love Cezanne, like his geometric, like just like kind of like square and rectangle shapes in his like landscape specifically, or his like paintings of villages are some of my favorite things. I love Van Gogh, but my favorite stuff of his are like a lot of his drawings, like charcoal studies of like hands or of people. Artemisia Gentileschi, we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I mean, I also think like she was just a beautiful painter, like just a beautiful painter. But like her work specifically focusing on women in powerful situations or lack thereof in the Bible, you know, in her own life story, you know, which I relate to in general. I love her work, you know, just beheading guys is pretty awesome. And holding severed heads and things, because I also like dirty and like grimy kind of imagery, or like stuff that just doesn't like quite sit well with you.
That like uncomfortability.
Yeah, like I
looking
used
at
to be
something.
obsessed with these books called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I was obsessed with those when I was a kid.
Loved those books.
And like the imagery in them was like disgusting.
Very
and,
unsettling.
like, but also just like weird. Like it wasn't even quite scary because it was just like didn't quite even make sense.
Yeah.
I loved that. And like I really love like creepy kind of stuff like that. Yeah. And then probably just in general, I have works probably that come to mind. And I think like a lot of artists have this of just like random things that like they think of, they saw in their textbook and they're like, I don't know, it was a sculpture from the Hellenistic era. It doesn't even have an artist, but it like took my breath away.
Sure.
But I mean, for something that is pretty well known, that of course I love, that is like cliche to love, that doesn't really have to do with my art, but I just love it, is just like the Pietà. Like every time I see that sculpture, it's just literally like I feel like I can't breathe. Like it's even just like in photographs, you know what I mean? And I can't imagine, I'd probably pass out if I saw it in person. Like it's just outstandingly beautiful. Also probably like the Last Supper by Da Vinci, the geometry in that, and the way he specifically placed the figures speaking to one another, I love. I think that's beautiful and is something I would go for I'd go for it to be like Leonardo da Vinci.
Go for it.
I'd just like go for being that, like, you know, like a painter who just like transcended time, like basically. And I'm still talking about today from hundreds of years ago. But anyways, yeah, like I just love the geometry of that piece, and it's like a very weird size, like just this long rectangle. And I really like rectangles and squares. I like weird dimensions. Anyways, that was like a very weird tangent of me bringing up random
Not at all.
paintings and stuff. But
Not at all. I like to hear like all the intricacy of what people enjoy and how that kind of plays into their artwork. And I'm thinking of the other pieces that you brought with you for the gallery show, that like the beheading one is obviously beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
But the focus on portraiture is really fascinating. And the one artist that I wasn't super familiar with her, and I'm trying to think where, I can't even credit where, like I heard of her, I'm sure it was on TikTok, which I hate that like a good amount of my art history education about people of color is like on TikTok. But hey, it is what it is, and speaks a lot to our society.
Yeah, it really does.
But I always say her first name, Myrna Baez. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
No.
She's was a Puerto Rican artist and painter and printmaker who was really big in like bringing art education in her communities. But I wanted to actually just even show you this portrait, because I think when I saw this portrait, I was like struck with how the resemblance between just kind of like your style and the color palette. And I wish I could make this bigger. So for those listening, this Myrna Baez piece is a self-portrait of the artist, and it's about from the waist up. She's turned a little bit to the left, but making direct eye contact with the viewer. And it's all painted in blacks and this kind of like dark reddish brown wash, where the background is very drippy and textured. And there's an outline of her wearing maybe like a sweater or a shirt that has a very heavy collar on it. She's sitting up very straight with her eyebrows furrowed a little bit. There's some white space on her cheek and her neck that serve as like a highlight from where the light source is coming from. And her hair is all piled on her head and kind of around her head. Looks a little bit curly, but it's very abstract and kind of drippy.
I love that a lot. Is that a self-portrait?
I believe so, yes.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And it was almost, the color was the first thing that like really struck me. Is this kind of like warm orange brown.
And like the unfinished kind of color blocking.
And the drips. But yeah.
That's beautiful. I guess too, like that's very gestural. And like the thing I love about gesture specifically is like, I like for people to see what the actual process is.
Yes.
For artists through their work. Like not that I hate it. I mean, of course, I find all types of art beautiful, like all different kinds of genres. But for me personally, like I don't like to see something that just looks like really crisp and clean and like you're not quite sure even how it layered or like I love when you can tell, you can almost feel how the artist moved.
Yeah.
When they were painting.
I think those are some of my favorite works, and I'm very drawn to impressionist work and like modern abstraction. And we talked a little bit before about like Jack Whitten and Jackson Pollock and exactly that. Like I'm a very visual person, so like when I can see brush texture or like individual globs of paint, I really connect with art that you can see that in for exactly that reason, is that like I can sit and look at something and visualize the artist like making it while I look at it, which is a huge part of enjoying art for me personally.
I think that's why too, like you saying that made me think of why I like, or like why Calder's like mobiles are so intriguing.
Yes.
Because it's like just for the way that you can see his intentions in creating it and his expertise in how they move because, you know, like he had to engineer, you know what I mean? The design of them. That's what can be interesting about sculptures too, is like really being able to see the engineering of it or, you know, just like learning in art school about, you know, the David and, you know, why his head is kind of too big for his body because you're supposed to view it from below and things like that.
Yeah. I had a project in school that was about local art that is inspired by classic art. Yeah. And one of my favorite pieces of public art in the Lehigh Valley is the sculptures down on the Banana Factory campus by Carol Mikolas.
Yes.
Who's a local artist. Very, very indicative of like, he's an extremely talented sculptor who does realist pieces. He has a piece on Lehigh's campus of Asa Packer that's very realistic. But these sculptures, I'm so drawn to them because they're super indicative of like a Venus.
Yeah.
Created without arms, but also very focused on like female figure and almost faceless. Like they have a face, but faceless. You can see how this artwork is like the intention and the inspiration versus like the final output.
Yes.
Is just really interesting to me. And I think those are a really good representation of like exactly what we're talking about, where people pull inspiration from stuff but really make it their own. And I don't know what his specific intention was with those pieces. I don't know why the women are faceless and armless and have really nice breasts and like all this, like all of this. But that's like a good illustration in my own head for like point A to point B to point C and beyond.
Definitely.
And I find it interesting.
I guess too, like now that we're talking about portraiture and art inspirations and stuff, and now that you showed me that too, maybe think of a couple of other specifically, like, because then I started thinking like, so I didn't mention any portraiture artists, like, like, what do I like? Of course, Rembrandt is an incredible painter, but also, like, I've always been drawn to portraits that were kind of like game changers or like artists who almost were like journalists who painted peasants or, you know, in quotes, lower class people, or even like the girl with the pearl earring, like those kinds of portraits where you're just looking at a person who was real but you like, and now they're like, they were kind of a nobody, but now they're kind of like encapsulated in time forever. You know what I mean? As something almost like godlike or like, you know, otherworldly sort of. I have a lot of portraits that I like not necessarily artists, but like that I love. But also I was thinking too of like, once you showed me that, Frida Kahlo, and I'm not a huge fan of her work, technically speaking, like just I mean, personally, like not that she wasn't like technically incredible, but she has a crispness to her work that I'm just not very drawn to. So I don't really pull inspiration from how she painted, but taking her own experiences and painting herself, obviously, I really, am attached to that similar idea, for sure.
Absolutely. So we talked a lot about your work and how your educational background really plays a lot into what your work looks like and the artwork that you make now. But I'm curious, you mentioned a little bit before we started recording, talking about like your personal background and your cultural background, and how does that impact what your work looks like and the work that you're making right now?
So one of the reasons that I am also very tied to self-portraiture, which seems kind of selfish in theory, but also specifically relates to my want or need to show other people what my life experience could be like, related to the adversity that I've dealt with throughout my life. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, with my father is Puerto Rican and my mom is Jewish, I never quite really fit in. I had a lot of really particular circumstances growing up, being a survivor of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, being, family dealing with financial problems. My mom has an autoimmune neuromuscular disease, and, she was in and out of the hospital a lot of my childhood, and we had a lot of medical expenses that created certain financial problems in my family that were difficult to explain to people, especially as a kid, or get people to understand. Mm-hmm. When I was 10, our house was foreclosed upon, and we had to live in a home for through winter without heat and things like that. So my background, not just when it comes to culturally speaking, but also just my experiences growing up, I feel was very unique and made it very hard for me to relate to people or to get people to understand where I was coming from. From a very young age, especially too, just with who my parents are, they just were always educating us, showing us documentaries. When we were kids, we used to play, my brothers and I, Lewis and Clark, because we were obsessed with the Ken Burns documentary, which was, not necessarily a normal thing for, 8-year-olds to, be obsessed with, but, we really were. We loved history. My parents taught me a lot about civil rights, about my background specifically, coming from an interfaith and biracial, family. My parents made understanding our culture and being proud of our culture really important in our lives. So from a very young age, from when I was in kindergarten, I had pictures of Dr. King hung up in my bedroom, and would go to the library at school and check out only books about the civil rights movement. I was very obsessed with the civil rights movement and Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. The first chapter book I ever read was Who Was Harriet Tubman, I think. So I by the time I got into middle school and high school, I was always getting into fights with students, teachers, anyone who I thought said something that I found offensive. I would hunt kids down if I heard them say the R slur in the hallway and be why'd you say that? Here's all the historic context as to why that's inappropriate. And they'd be okay, we're 14, what are you doing? So that put me in a lot of weird circumstances, especially going to church and school, or meeting people different places, having friends, because kids would be Eliana, you're always offended by the things that we say, or, you always want to talk about racism. You always want to talk about serious stuff. You always want to talk about your experience and things, and sometimes we just want to have fun. We just want to be teenagers. And I was yeah, but I can't be, you know what I mean? This is who I am. This is my life. And so just because you get to take it, and I think that's something about prejudice I always try to get across to people, you know what I mean? Especially in terms of now after the George Floyd movement and a lot of performative activism online, activism isn't just something you pick up and put down. And that's the whole point of people of color, women, queer people, poor people. We don't just pick up and put down our experience. We carry it with us everywhere, and the weight of it follows us everywhere. So everything we do is inherently about our experiences with prejudice and, growing up in the U.S. So a lot of my work, in discussing the exploitation of women and racism and advertising also has to do with, being a kid and not feeling represented or included anywhere because of my background and my experiences.
You said creating portraiture is selfish, that you make it for selfish reasons.
It just feels like, because sometimes I just sit back and I'm like, oh my God, like all I paint is myself. Is that like weird? Like I don't.
You're creating the representation you wanted to see, right?
Yeah, I guess that is true. Yeah.
I think it's important. And it's beautiful work too.
Thank you so much.
So I hope you don't think of it as selfish, because I'd like to see more of it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, I hope people will take the time to come and see your work in person. Are there places online that people can find images of some of your work?
Yeah, you can go on my Instagram. It's at Eliana Vélez _art.
ELIANAVELEZ Well, Eliana, thank you so much for coming in today. And thank you for talking about your work.
Thanks, Eliana and Elise, for that awesome conversation. We are happy to announce that Eliana will be the next artist on display at the gallery at Steel Pixel Studios. The show will run from Wednesday, September 14th through the beginning of November. The opening reception will be on Wednesday, September 21st from 6:30 to 8 p.m. That will be at 701 North New Street, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Make sure you stop by, say hi, and see the works in person. We hope to see you there.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast, a Steel Pixel original series. Don't forget to like the podcast, leave us a review, and follow us on both social media and streaming services at Lehigh Valley Arts Podcast.